I come from a small town in Kentucky. My accent might give that away. I was born on the Ohio River in a little town called Ashland. My summers were spent in an even smaller, more rural area of Kentucky that's listed on modern maps as Gunstock Branch, but I called it Grandma's house. Today I'm talking about Grandma's lessons for both me and my cousins. Welcome to the 10-Minute Food Truck Training Podcast. My name is Bill Moore. I am a food truck business coach, author of 5 food truck vending books, including Food Truck 101 and Food Truck 201. This podcast is all about helping you start and grow your food truck business. Today's podcast is sponsored by Table Needs. And if you're looking for a game changer for your food truck business, look no further than Table Needs. It is the ultimate package, a killer point of sale system, QR code menu ordering, KDS, and automated sales tax. Plus, they offer business services like marketing and bookkeeping. They're not only just another vendor, they're a business partner. Check them out at tableneeds.com or find them on Facebook. Going to Grandma's house meant 2 things. Got to play with my cousins, and we had to work in the garden. Being one of the 3 oldest cousins meant that we had to do a little bit more physical work than the younger kids did. I was 7, and technically I was a city boy, and I had to be taught some of the things that my country cousins already knew because they lived it every single day. Grandma sat me down before heading off to the garden to explain how important it was to her and my grandfather that the garden be properly tended. They and my younger aunts and uncles that were still living with my grandparents, they depended upon the food that the garden produced. They were subsistence farmers. They needed the fruits and they needed the vegetables to be able to eat. In the summer, fresh veggies every day. In the winter, they depended upon the canned goods and the dried goods that my grandmother put up from the previous harvest. And then she ended the talk with, "Tending the garden feeds us all." I liked working with my grandmother. She was always talking, she was singing, she was always keeping the mood very light while we were tending the garden. And she was always teaching us without us even knowing that we were in school. My grandmother continued working in the garden long after all of my aunts and uncles had moved out of her house. She was out in the garden, and she was doing it every year up until she just physically could not do it anymore. Now, that first summer when I was old enough to be of use to my grandmother, she took each of us, my cousins and myself, through the garden and all the chores that she wanted us to do and how she wanted them to be done. She taught us things like how to weed the garden, how to kill the bugs that get into or onto the plants. She even talked about how to prune away dead branches or pull the puny plants to allow the stronger ones more room to grow. Which it seems easy, right? You pull the weeds, you leave the plants. You kill the bugs. It's got to be a boy's dream job. When the plants are young, though, they can be mixed with weeds that grow faster than the plant you want to grow. And when you're 7 years old, you don't always know the difference in a corn shoot from a green bean, from a tomato, from a dandelion. But my cousins did, because they lived it. So grandmother set our task of weeding and fertilizing and debugging 4 rows each. She told us those 4 rows would be ours for the summer to take care of. And those rows seem to go on for miles, especially when you're 7 years old. But I just looked it up on Google Maps and used the measurement feature, and they're 400 feet long rows. And that was from fence line to fence line. And around the fence, we had about a 3 or 4 foot border. So they were probably about 390 feet long rows. But it seemed like miles. Once our gardening chores were done, we were allowed to go out and play. Being boys, we usually ended up in the creek catching crawdads or skimming rocks. Sometimes we would walk up and down the dirt roads looking for the glass soda bottles that they used to sell back then, and we would take them to the store and get the deposit money and buy ourselves a candy bar or a bag of chips, or that super rare thing, a can of soda. The first time we did our rows, my cousins finished way earlier than I did. In fact, they finished their 4 rows by the time I got done with my first. And they were off playing in the creek and having fun while I was facing the heat of the day, still having 3 more rows to hoe. And this went on for weeks. They always got done before me every single time. Sometimes they finished so far ahead of me that they would go out and collect the bottles, buy a candy bar, come back to the garden and sit and eat the candy bar in front of me, laughing and making fun of me. Because, I'm that city slicker that couldn't keep up with the country boys. Towards the middle of summer, I was getting so frustrated with the chores and my cousins that I just quit one day, sat in the middle of the rows, and I was just crying. I was just bawling like a baby. My cousins were already done. They were gone off playing, and there I was, still facing about 3.5 rows of corn to take care of. The sun went down over the mountain, and it started to get a little bit dark. And my grandmother came out to look for me because I didn't come home for supper. I was out in the garden still, sitting in the middle of all the corn. She found me, and she came, sat down beside me, and said in her little country accent, "What's troubling you, Billy?" And I told her I was absolutely doing my best, and I just couldn't get as fast as my cousins. All I wanted to do was play in the creek or explore the closed coal mines or climb up and down the mountains. I just wanted to go out and have some fun, but it seemed like all I had enough time to do was do the chores in the garden, and then the day was done. My grandmother laughed a hearty laugh, and she gave me the biggest bear hug possible. Then she said very quietly, "Do you think your best is good enough?" And I said, and as soon as I said this, I started crying again. "I think I'm doing it just like you told me." She stood up, held her hand out, and said, "You are present in your work, and your cousins are present in their play. Now let's go get you fed." I had no idea what that meant. I thought it was just a country way of saying, "Billy, you're slow, but I love you anyway." Grandma's planting practice was to mix green beans with corn so that you wouldn't need to stake the green beans. The green beans would just vine up the corn stalk, and then you would save that time and money of having to try to stake them. And then as they grew up, they were much easier to pick. So harvest time for the green beans was near the end of summer, and all of the cousins and myself would be in the garden armed with those aluminum dish pans that it seems like all people had back in the day, back before they invented double sinks. And then we also had all manner of metal buckets to pick up the green beans and to pick the ears of corn. Grandpa had staggered the planting, and what that means is we would always have fresh vegetables coming ripe every week or every couple of weeks. So the entire garden was always having to be tended and harvested at different times. So there was always work to be done. But the rows that the cousins and myself had were the earliest ones because we would have to start back into school and wouldn't have time to tend the rest of the garden for the remainder of the late summer and fall. So what would happen is we would go out and harvest everything and get it prepped up for Grandma, and then she would, of course, cook some of it for dinners and lunches, but some of it would also be canned so that we would have it for the winter. And then others of it would be dried. And the idea of that staggering planting was so that all the food could be handled before it started to go bad. As with the weeding and the fertilizing, when we started our harvest, my cousin finished their rows way ahead of me. I was halfway down the first row when I heard one of my cousins holler, "Creek time," and off he ran. As I started my second row, all the rest of my cousins were done. And when I finally finished picking all the green beans and all the corn out of my 4 rows, it was time to eat dinner, or time to eat supper as we called it, and go to bed. The next day after breakfast, we would all be out on the front porch, and we would start the arduous task of removing the strings and breaking up the beans into smaller segments for canning. We would end up shelling some of the green beans, and then still others would just be strung up for drying. So we had all different kind of work to do with our own individual piles of green beans. So everyone's on the porch working the green beans they had collected. And then Grandpa stopped by to check in on our progress before he headed off to his job. And he said, "Great work, boys, but there seems to be something wrong." All of my cousins in unison asked, "What's wrong?" I had no idea what was wrong. Grandpa walked to each of my cousins. He looked at their dish pans of green beans and the pile of corn next to them. And he looked at each of my cousins. And then I was the last one he checked. He stopped at my chair and was towering over me as I was sitting there trying to string some green beans. And he walked around to the front of me, stuck his hand out and said, "Put her there, boy," and shook my hand like it was a water pump that was in the kitchen. He said, "You have more green beans and more corn than your other cousins combined." And that was the first time that I realized that I did have way more corn and green beans than they had. He said, "We'll be eating good this winter, and that's thanks to you." And then that handshake turned into just another great big bear hug. And then I noticed my grandmother sitting in her rocking chair, nodding her head in agreement. So later, Grandma came to me after we were done with the morning and getting ready to have lunch. And she said, "Do you remember when I told you you were present in your work? What I meant was your mind was on the work you were doing while you were doing it. And that's just like I taught you. Your cousins, their mind was on playtime, but their hands were still working. Your brain and your hands have to be in the same place at the same time. When that happens, we get to eat in the winter and not worry if we'll have enough food to make it to the next harvest." That was the day that I learned that gardening was not just a hobby for them, They depended upon it to eat year-round. That's when I learned what subsistence farming meant. You see, they had chickens for meat and also for eggs. They had a cow for milk. I used to help with the cow. I used to help Grandma pick the eggs. I used to help her chase chickens down when she wanted to cook one for Sunday dinner. And it was the first time I actually saw the big picture. You see, my dad was an auto parts salesman. That's all he ever did. My mom was a banker. She was an accountant. She knew numbers. We bought our food from a grocery store. We had a couple of little rows that we had in our backyard that we called a garden, but we certainly weren't canning food, not on the volume that my grandmother was doing. We were having the fresh corn, maybe a couple of weeks out of the year, and that was it. The rest of the time, we were off to the grocery store to buy it. My grandparents were different, though. They grew their own food. They cooked over an open fire in the fireplace until electric was ran in the holler that they lived in. They had a well pump in the kitchen, one of those that you had to pump up and down vigorously to get a little trickle of water coming out. Plus, they had a traditional deep well about 10 to 15 feet off the back door, and it's the one that you have probably seen in pictures where it has the little roof with a rope and a bucket at the end of the rope. My great-grandmother, who was out in the garden with us many, many times, she used the outhouse that was about 40 feet from her door, and she continued to use it after indoor plumbing was put in the rest of the house. They were backwards people in many senses of the word, and then they were more advanced than most people are today. I'm a hillbilly. I'm a food truck owner. I'm a trainer. I am what I am. But most of all, I learned a long, long time ago to be present in everything I do, and that was thanks to my grandmother. Thank you so much for listening to the 10-Minute Food Truck Training Podcast. If you're finding all the information helpful to your food truck business, please become a monthly supporter of the podcast. Just hit the support button or follow the link in the description. Every little bit does help keep us going. Join our Facebook group. It's called Food Truck Training. We have a whole bunch of awesome members at all different levels, from brand new beginners to decades-old veterans. They've all got your back when it comes to helping you with your food truck. And again, thank you for listening. Come back tomorrow because I got plenty more to say when it comes to helping you and your food truck business grow.